Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Reclaim TV. We've been doing this for a little while now, Taylor, haven't we? And it's just not you and I, it's you and Meredith and you and Pilot. But Reclaim TV is our weekly live stream to talk about a variety of things. And today we are thankfully and joyfully joined by Corrine Guimont and Alex Kinnaman to talk about how Virginia Tech is thinking about and managing archiving a variety of their digital projects. And we actually, I saw Corrine speak at DH, or Digital Humanities 2024 conference in Washington, D.C. And it was really nice, Corrine, right? Like there was no humidity. It was beautiful temperatures. Oh my God. I felt bad for all the Europeans who came to like Washington, D.C. in the most humid, horrible moment. But anyway, that's another conversation. But I saw Corrine, who was part of a panel that was talking about just this idea of how various institutions are managing their institutional archiving. And I found it a really compelling discussion. So I wanted to invite Corrine to join us on Reclaim TV and talk a little bit about that. So welcome, Corrine and Alex.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, we have come prepared. That's usually not the case. So I just want to, anyone who's watching who sees that we're prepared, I just want to say, take a step back. It's all right. We'll get through this.
We haven't been replaced yet.
So one of the things we just wanted to, jump off and kind of get a sense from Corrine and Alex is, what's the range of digital projects? I mean, we can talk about digital projects and it kind of seems like, oh, what does that mean? But like, what does that look like at Virginia Tech, right? Like, what are we talking about when we talk about digital projects that you all deal with in the library? And, how do you manage them? Like, what is that, give us a sense, just so we're not talking abstractly, but kind of more specifically about what you do with digital projects at your university.
So this is a loaded question because we have a crazy range of project types, how they might come into us, what we might do with them, and where they go. So there are 4 primary workflows for digital projects, and each has their own platform or series of platforms in a specific department. Our institutional repository is VTechWorks. This is for scholarship from faculty, staff, students. This is where all of our theses go, presentations go, event captures go. And this is built on DSpace. The sister repository to this is our data repository. It's completely separate. It's actually hosted on Figshare now, and is specifically for large data sets or data that doesn't quite fit the mold of VTechWorks, but is still scholarship. And then both of these are self-submission. They're reviewed by their respective departments, and then they're ingested. And Corrine and I kind of have the other side of that coin. I'm in the Digital Libraries and Preservation Department, and we support digitization projects, born digital projects moving to our digital library. Our preservation system is something we also manage. And we also have a current project to migrate our special collections and university archives from a legacy site to our digital library. And these collections that we manage can range from 2D items, 3D items, data objects, and come from anywhere. Campus, library, community. The dean says, please do something with this. Corrine gives me things. So it's a pretty wide range, and I'll pass it to Corrine because publishing is yet another separate but mighty beast.
Yeah, so I run our publishing imprint out of the library, Virginia Tech Publishing. So it's all open access publications. And we also do a lot of digital scholarship projects. So about a year and a half ago, if you had talked to me, I was our digital scholarship librarian, which is why I was at the DH 2024 conference. But within publishing, we have journals hosted through what we use Ubiquity for our journals. We also have several books. We use Pressbooks a little bit for some of our book projects, as well as some other platforms. OER, Open Educational Resources, as people are going to OE Global next week. And the big one, and this is probably where mine and Alex's research has overlapped quite a bit, is digital humanities and digital scholarship. In the past, prior to 2019, we were kind of figuring out different ways to host projects. So working with the library, working with other units on campus. But then in 2019, as you guys know, we started working with Reclaim and launched we use VT domains for that. We call our instance of Reclaim hosting VT domains. So that's where a lot of our digital scholarship projects are now hosted, to be able to offer that to people on campus. And some of those are stuff that we're publishing out of Virginia Tech Publishing, and some of those are it's kind of like a DIY service for anybody on campus to kind of maybe use it within their class or anything like that. So that's kind of the variety of projects that we're dealing with within Virginia Tech Publishing. It's a little bit different. It's not the self-submission that our repositories that Alex mentioned use. It's more so goes through an editorial process to be able to share that material.
So our follow-up question was kind of like answered in this question because you were so thorough in getting to kind of talk about all the different infrastructures you support, which kind of raises a different question that maybe we can talk about little, is like you're dealing with a lot of different vendors and pieces of software, and what that looks like in terms of just management and overhead for that is a super interesting question that might take up. But I'm also seeing like there's almost a bifurcation of roles, right? There's the publishing role, and then there's what I'm hearing like the repository role. Where do those two, or do those two overlap in some way?
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, when we're talking about publishing, we use the repositories a lot. And I talked about this at DH 2024 too. We use the repositories a lot to kind of help back up that material. So our journals are hosted with our journal management system, but then we also try to get them included in VTechWorks, our institutional repository. Same thing with a lot of our books and textbooks as well. And then especially when it comes to the digital scholarship projects, we really encourage our researchers to deposit the data of those projects into the data repository as well. So kind of using those repositories as a way to, in case one of these infrastructures goes down, this stuff is still out there somewhere.
So do you have a hard time helping people navigate that? Like like faculty that you're working with, or is this sort of just like, here's the plan, you kind of tell them this is where it's going to go? Like, what does that look like typically?
Is that one for me? It depends on the project. It depends on their familiarity with the services we have, their technical literacy and archival literacy, and how much bandwidth and resources any and all of us might have. In some cases, it's mapped out. We will consult on a grant, for example, and provide them with text and provide them with the plan ahead of time, and then it usually follows mostly that plan as we go. And sometimes it's a little ad hoc where, like I mentioned, we'll get a request. It's like, hey, something needs to be done with this pretty soon. And it will be a quick scramble together in a short amount of time to find a solution.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a matter of us adding that into our workflow. So before we publish, or when we go through the process of publishing a book, we also just add it in our workflow to upload that to our institutional repository kind of at the same time. So it's a mix.
That's awesome. One of the things we always talk about with folks that we're working with here is the best time to think about archival is, people think of archival as the end of something. They're like, you should be archiving from the beginning, really, and where possible, at least. And it's the worst to come after the fact and go, how are we going to do this? Versus how can we design things to be archivable?
This is thrilling for me. My original role at Virginia Tech was the digital preservation coordinator, and we've done a lot of work to advocate for that, and it's exciting to hear people, even in my department, but also other departments, be like, "Oh, that's not good for preservation. We should probably try this one," and it just butterflies. I love it.
That's awesome.
It's actually interesting point there is like, do you have archives that are spread across various programs and institutions? I imagine with Virginia Tech, big school, a lot of different funding and different departments in different pockets. Like, are archives kind of spread across the university, and then maybe they consult with you to kind of go with it, or sometimes they're completely independent of the library? How does that work, or does that work?
Well, there's certainly likely to be collections and archives across campus that we don't know about or that we've consulted on. But if we don't manage it, we typically don't have a big hands-on role. Again, with an exception of a grant maybe, where we're more active consultants on something. But it is spread out throughout the library. We have, I want to say 4 or 5 departments that manage some kind of service, and then other departments in the library that support that service.
And is the case where people will have a grant or, have built something and then come to you after the fact, never being kind of informed about what was happening or how it was built, and say, like, we really would like to have this preserved. Like, what are our options? Is that a common reality for you all?
Yeah, I think it was probably more common. Alex and I both started at the library in 2017, and we've really been trying to educate folks, come to us earlier in the process, so that way we can help have this conversation. So it's gotten, I think folks are coming to us a little bit earlier. But it was definitely more common when I first started, where people would be like, hey, I built this site. And at the time we didn't have domain of one's own. So they were like, can the library host it and keep it forever? And I was like, whoa. I don't even know if our IT is able to manage this technology that you've built your site on. So that was number one, come to us if you want it hosted with us. We need to know what technology it's built on to even know if it's something that we can manage. And then also it kind of depended in terms of how well documented their project was, how well organized the materials were. And it's easier if we're part of that conversation from the get-go to help have that, help them set it up in a way that's easily documented and organized. So that way at the end of the project, we just take those kind of pieces and put them where they need to go. So I think it's less common for folks to come to us with the final project and be like, here you go. We're trying to get them to, but it still happens. We're just trying to get folks to come to us earlier on in the process.
For sure. And to add to that, we did talk to our developers and our sysadmins to see if we can take things on. We consulted with many folks over the years, and it's just a challenge to migrate something that is managed by IT specifically, because we need someone with that back-end knowledge to keep a plugin updated so that it's not Corrine going through every month being like, all right, see if we can update this one, I think maybe. And Corrine has done a lot of training for folks and offered a lot of opportunities for folks to learn the tools that are provided by especially her department, but in the library, to better prepare for these kind of projects.
I never really thought of it like you're doing at the University of Mary Washington, where I worked for 10 years. My job was educational technology, right? So I was training people on how to use WordPress or other tools and I never really thought of a librarian, the kind of parallel role of training folks on, these are the tools we're providing you to make things easier, a very parallel thing. So it's interesting to think about getting that word out, as I'm hearing from both of you, is a crucial part of what a librarian would do in this moment to make archiving not only more seamless, right, but a kind of almost an educational process, right? This is what's possible. This is what you can do. Here's how you do it, etc. So that's pretty cool for me to hear.
One of the things kind of jumping off that is I think in this space, and maybe people who watch this now or later are probably sold on the idea of preservation of things, at least in concept. Do you find yourself having to sell faculty or students on the value of keeping things? I mean, I know that might sound a little bit, it's my experience that not everyone values these things as much, right? Do you have to sell folks on this, or is it more here are the tools we have available and how to use it? Or do you kind of start from a why even bother standpoint? Do you have elevator pitches? What's your secret there?
I think more people are sold on preservation already. They want their stuff to be preserved, but they don't necessarily realize how, especially in the digital world. Technology changes so fast, and kind of the materials that they're dealing with. I think it's more so a sell of, you can't just give it to the library and it's automatically preserved. I think that's an assumption that happens a lot, where they're like, hey, the library has it, it's going to be safe forever. And I'm like, wait, there's work involved in preserving that. We need to we need to organize materials. So it's more so just like the educational piece around what preservation actually is. And Alex, again, you probably know more. So my background was in preservation before I moved into my current role. So that's why Alex and I get involved in this conversation back and forth a lot. But her day-to-day work is preservation. So she probably deals with that more than me.
Yeah, and it's a big question again for me. So selling a developer team, that was the first step, because if we don't have the infrastructure, the technical infrastructure to support it, it's really challenging to kind of cobble together a preservation system or even just a plan and know that you have that kind of support. So that did take a little bit. Developers tend to not want to put multiple redundancies in place. It's considered extra or maybe unnecessary. They're like, we have backups. And I'm like, no. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. Locks. It was a challenge, and now again we've had fantastic people decide that they wanted to learn about it. I've got people learning preservation metadata and talking about fixity on a regular basis and checksums and integrity checks in general, and that's been fantastic. Funding hasn't really been an issue. We got very lucky. Our dean and our director of IT both have backgrounds in digital preservation. Corrine and I have backgrounds in digital preservation. But the one thing we actually have trouble with, it's not so much the why bother, it's actually appraisal and having really challenging conversations with people, because everyone's work is important. It all has a value. It is extremely valuable to individuals. And it's valuable to the university, but we have finite resources. So sometimes we have to have those conversations about, all right, this is the most that we can do with this content at this time based on our criteria. And we encourage people to make the case and to push. I mean, squeaky wheel is very real, but if we only have so many resources. So it's sometimes we have to say, like, we can take this much, or we can take these types. And then we can help you find a solution for everything else. So that's an interesting one.
Yeah. You're muted, Jim.
Muted in Jitsi. Okay. I didn't want to interrupt you, Taylor, if you had a question there, but I did have a question there, Alex. So what is some of that general criteria of, what the university tends to value more when it comes to preservation and does get preserved over, say, other things? Like, is that clear, or is that kind of, case by case? I don't want to ask a general question just to, it may not be a useful question in that, but I'm interested, like, what is valued as you see it and what does get preserved over other things?
Absolutely. And stop me when I've gone on too long. I can talk about this topic for a while. Preservation appraisal is a big topic. There are sustainability components, both environmental and resource-wise at your institution. There's what the university might find important versus what the library might find important versus what the community might find important. So we're kind of balancing a lot of that, and it does go case by case most of the time. Anything that is produced by Virginia Tech is very important. It is what makes us unique. It is the unique things that are coming from us as a campus, as a university community. Other content that might get special attention is coming from places with fewer resources. They can't have any kind of backup solution. They have no funding, they have no resources, they have no people, but they hold extremely valuable content to Virginia Tech or Virginia as a region, or to the state, even to the university. So it can be based on that. It depends on how many people and how much time they have to dedicate. If they can say, we've got a student who might be able to document some stuff, it's like, okay, we can't work with as much with that as we could with like a team of students doing XYZ. So this is how we're going to meet you to where it needs to be, and then we'll do this much. We also have preservation levels. So our digital library and our digital preservation infrastructure are built on Amazon Web Services. So we have various buckets, a lot of S3 buckets and some Glacier buckets. Stop me if I'm using too much jargon.
No, I'm just doing a project with buckets right now, so I feel you.
Oh yeah. So in that, Corrine, I want to get you a bucket. That's the next step after our VTech Works gets a bucket. So once it's here, it's local. Preservation level 1, we've taken a look at it. It's got a checksum. It's safe in our access repository. Level 2 will go to Glacier as well. So we'll have the static largest, best copy in Glacier with AWS. And then preservation level 3, which is pretty limited to certain things, is it also goes into Academic Preservation Trust. It's one of our digital preservation services that we are members of. And we have a finite amount of space there. We have 10 terabytes that are built into our subscription, and then we pay for more. So that has taken a little bargaining. I work with another department that convinced me that, we'll do the workflow, we'll manage the workflow if we can put all of our content there. And that was a good deal. It was a great deal. So it's very dependent on who has what, how unique it is, how fragile it is, where it's coming from, et cetera, et cetera. I'll stop there. I can go on.
I love this because I think Jim, you're perhaps in a similar place of me with this, in that we tend to, as folks at a web hosting company, I think more about having a copy and maybe in multiple formats. Basically, we're focused on the sort of the tools or technology that we can use, right, to bring it back or look at it or view it or whatever. And hearing about, I love hearing about this stuff from like a library's perspective, because it goes to a completely different thing that I have zero expertise in, which is like, yeah, that's great, but further than that, you need to think about, multiple copies in multiple places, checksumming, which is like a thing I'm aware of but don't really do for my own stuff, and then like it's really interesting because I almost in my head map these as like sort of different axes on a scale or a graph of like, there's sort of flexibility or tools kind of based stuff, and then there's who are we trusting with this with the ones and zeros, right? Like, are we trusting this platform from AWS, this other platform from AWS, and another entity entirely? Like, it's escalating risk. So I guess thank you for the detail, because that is really interesting to at least me, and I imagine Jim and probably some other folks watching this.
We also call this paranoid copying, paranoid checking. It's they hired me for that, right? That's fine.
Yeah, Alex, I come from that point of view. Like, backups for me, like, have saved the business like countless times. Mm-hmm. Like, literally, like, a server has gone down. Do we have backups in another place that we can, bring up a new server? And frankly, we've been pretty good about that from the beginning, and knock on wood, wherever it is, because you never can be good enough, it seems. But it's interesting to hear, like Taylor says, I am fascinated about the 3 levels. Like, does this one go to academic trust? Like, when does it go to that special bucket in the sky where it kind of lives? And that's actually the idea of definitive or finite resources, right? Really does also play into that, because as much as AWS seems infinite, right? The cost associated with it, the time, the technical expertise, right? All of these things, start to play into that. And it's one of my questions that I can follow up with on now is, you said, both Corrine and Alex, you said on several occasions, like, working with developers, right? And when you're doing these assessments, like, I'm interested, how many projects that you're working on, say in the last 3 to 5 years, are bespoke technologies that you've created in Virginia Tech, versus how many others that are things that you're either buying from vendors or are part of another kind of a bigger project that you're buying into, whether it's academic or whatnot? I know, and my question will be as long as your answer, so I'm sorry. But I know, like, when I first came into higher ed, there were so many bespoke solutions, right, at different universities that you had a developer create. And I'm wondering, is that still the case, or have we moved away from that entirely? Is that coming back because I don't know. Like, I'm honestly asking, like, what is Virginia Tech's relationship to custom solutions for your community?
So I think that comes out of a lot of the like larger digital scholarship projects. And there's probably been like a handful over the past few years that we've done where they work with a developer and really build something custom. One that I'm thinking of is called The American Soldier in World War II, and that was built by a developer. It was an NEH grant funded project, and it was kind of this database aspect. So that's one that's not actually hosted by the library. It's hosted by another unit on campus, but we've worked with the researcher to like put all the data in data repositories, to crawl the website using Archive It, and kind of save the material in lots of copies. And now I know there's a few other projects that I'm involved in right now where they're kind of building those things, but those tend to be like less common, I think, because they usually do require a lot of grant funding. So going for those big grants, a couple $100,000 usually, or even like I'm involved in a grant project right now where we're getting ready to apply for like our third round of grants. We went through prototyping and implementing, and now we're going to actually build the thing. And I think that's kind of becoming a common thing with the federal agencies that are providing these. So you're talking like 6 years before the thing is actually built. In that case, when we in the library are involved, and I know Alex has been involved in some of those projects, and so have I, it's easier for us to have that conversation with people early on to say like, hey, this is what we should do, and this is how we can preserve your material. So that helps. But I also would say, like, in terms of vendor produced stuff, we've definitely moved to that aspect quite a bit. Our biggest reason for doing domain of one's own was because so many people were wanting to spin up different WordPress and Omeka sites, and we were going, okay, we can't just, like, it's more work for us to spin these up every time versus having a service that just allows people to kind of spin it up themselves. So that saves a lot there.
It is kind of an interesting blend, something like that, right? Where from our perspective, domain of one's own is a thing we're providing you, you're paying, we're supporting it, right? But it's so that people can use open source tools that aren't necessarily vendor specific.
Mm-hmm.
We like to play in that space. That's our whole thing, obviously. But I wonder how much we'll see that mixture over time. Is it go more in that direction, further away?
For the digital library, we wanted something that we could customize, but that wasn't extremely costly. And that's where, AWS is very popular right now in digital libraries. A lot of people are moving into that space in various ways. For us, it's because you said projects in the last 3 to 5 years. I don't know many, I think, but we've been building this digital library because just getting a light infrastructure set up does not an access platform or preservation platform make. We have moved to creating microservices. So we have our base infrastructure, and then, all right, the ingest microservice. And this ingest microservice is flexible for these types of formats and these ways. This is how we tile, and this is what we use. And then when we hit a bump, it's like, all right, and now we adjust. Because what we produce in our digital imaging lab is of a different type or quality than what we might receive from a community cultural heritage organization that needs to be processed a little differently. We're starting to add in more functionality for AV, for 3D, for other multimodal views of data sets and like high-res images. So we're trying to build that customization in manually onto an existing infrastructure that is managed overall by someone else. So we'll use a lot of bash scripts, a lot of lambdas, a lot of just little baby Python scripts as well. Most of it's on GitHub, most of it's public, and some things are not, but it's definitely a mix of both, because we have our vendors, we have our memberships, which are kind of that mix between not quite a vendor because we're engaged in that community, but we still pay money. I see a cat. I got distracted. I loved it. No, not at all. And then a couple things that we've just spun up and managed locally.
That to me is super interesting for a variety of reasons, but one of them is the idea of you have the infrastructure, you're saying, which from what I'm hearing is AWS or some mighty service like that, and you're building microservices around it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does that kind of get to the kind of element of there is no custom bespoke individual apps, but there are ways to bring these services into an existing. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about the digital library. You've talked about it a couple of times. What does it mean when you're talking about the digital library, and like how does that kind of represent what you've just said? Is that fair?
That's fair. But to answer the question and a half before, yes. So building services around, one great example is AWS is still Amazon, right? How much do we trust them? They are a black box. The service is made really easy for us to use. You can get certified really quickly. They have they have amazing folks that come in and will train you. But we don't fully trust them. But they're like, well, our fixity checking is 99.9999999, et cetera, et cetera, accurate. I don't trust that. So our developers have been building a fixity service for us to be able to monitor every single event, every person, every object, every source file, so that we can go back, and if it flags something, we can go back and actually see it for ourselves without having to work with Amazon and justify it and try to break into that black box just a tiny bit. So there are a lot of ways that we can customize it and make it more usable for us and more transparent for us. Moving to your next question, what is the digital library? It's a great question. It has morphed over time. It was originally, we need a place to put new cool collections that are outside the scope of everything else. So our special collections and university archives, they have a very firm collecting scope. They have deeds of gifts. You must donate material. If they are managing it, they must own it. They had a legacy site that they were maintaining. They're actually moving into the digital library, which I'm very excited about. They're just a really firm scope. VTechWorks and the data repository, again, really firm scopes. It's not so much for, we have this awesome collection over at Art and Architecture, and sticking it in like a non-visually pleasing way into one of these repositories. Like, it'll work, it'll be fine, it'll be safe, but it's not like easy to find, easy to look at, or fun to look at in the same way. I can't speak to publishing, because if I handed you a series of photographs, I'm not sure what you would just hand them back to me, Corrine, probably. Yeah. So it's a place for everything that doesn't go in one of our existing services. So we work with community collections. We've got the Art and Architecture collection. That's a series of, we've had blueprints and specifications. We've also gotten some really gorgeous posters from them. There are more collections incoming. I'm very excited. We'll work with local cultural heritage organizations, bring their content here, digitize it, give the content back, give the digital facsimiles to them, and then also host it. So it's just a way to visualize any collection that seems fun, interesting, cool, Virginia Tech related or Virginia related. Our scope is nothing. We have no scope.
And one thing that publishing has specifically been working on is we've got a person on our team who's been doing some podcasting. So he's been generating podcasts. So he's been working with the digital libraries team to have all those podcasts kind of archived in the digital library as well. Yes. It's not live yet, but we're working on it.
We're working on it. We're testing out some oral histories and podcasting and one other AV something, but I can't remember what. I'm sorry.
We recently, so Taylor, if you want to ask a question, I'm going to ask 2 or 3 questions, as Alex pointed out. It's going to be like a machine gun. Be careful. Boom, 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 boom. But we recently had a discussion here on Reclaim TV, our live stream, with Amanda LaCastro, who's doing stuff with virtual reality and augmented reality. And they're at Swarthmore, and they also have unique collections like the Peace Collection, which has these huge, gigantic, like paper signs, that you really can only get a sense of in an archive if you take 3D, you take a 3D model of it, right, and then reproduce that. And they had a place where you can kind of walk into. It was kind of homegrown. They were building it, and I'm just interested, like with all of what you're saying, Alex. Like, is there a place where we can walk into the digital library and see some of this stuff? Like, does it have a kind of like, when I think about the library, I think about I'm going to walk into that digital library and experience the collections. And walk in obviously is a terrible metaphor, but how does that work? What does it look like? And do you like archive stuff like VR, AR, etc.?
We do. I'm so excited that this was a question that we were talking about. Our 3D program has a dedicated lab and it's pretty new, but it's growing. So we've largely focused on photogrammetry, and this is a capture method where you take the camera from various angles and you'll circle the object at different angles and take anywhere from 75 to 365 images. And it creates a texture, creates the mesh, and then the artist will go through and make it pretty. And we can render those. We can do anything as small as an insect. And we just tested, we got a new drone, which was very exciting.
Nice.
And our 3D technical artist did her house in glorious detail. You could see the individual shingles on her roof before she did any texturing herself. So it's really fantastic. And this is our main like academic program where we're like seeking collections to add to our collection and explore new capture methods, explore new ways of doing things. And then we have a program in the library called Applied Research in Immersive Experiences and Simulations. Aries. We'll go with Aries. So they focus more on AR and VR, and they do a lot of work. The difference in that is theirs is a bit more proprietary. Theirs is not open access necessarily. Like they'll share project updates, but sharing data or sharing methodologies, they don't really have any projects where they do that. So we've recently started having a lot of discussions on collaborating with an open access project. And I should have pointed this out about 30 minutes ago when Corrine mentioned everything we do is open access. Everything in the, I think, 4 or 5 services we've talked about is open access. And it is designed to be that way. But Aries is kind of a separate offshoot doing really cool, unique, innovative work. So we're going to try to work with them a bit more to get the VR and AR components along with the models that our 3D lab is creating. And right now we've got a beta viewer in IIIF that can render X3D file formats and I think GLTF and GLB. That's what we're working with right now.
See, that's super cool too, because one of the topics that came up when we were talking with Amanda LaCastro about this is so many of those resources are like controlled by, be it Meta or Steam or like very proprietary software and hardware that makes it almost impossible like to create an easy, accessible, open resource for archiving them. So it's super interesting that you're kind of working towards an option or an alternative, because that's one of the real challenges, according to Dr. LaCastro, of dealing and preserving any of that stuff.
Absolutely. And we're still working through this. We haven't found like the solution, but we use a very similar approach that Corrine and I use with the digital scholarship projects. We go for reconstruction rather than emulation, or rather than trying to figure out how am I going to open this software in 5 years, because it's 3D and VR and AR that evolves so quickly. We have objects from 5 or 6 years ago that it's like, crap, how do we open this now? Yeah. And that's just the nature of those types of software and software owners. But we do try to keep, so for photogrammetry, it's photographs. That's helpful. So we can keep just the raw images. We can keep the texture and the mesh. And it creates a very light package. And then have all of the metadata and the documentation and descriptions on like, here's what we created before. Here's how you can do it again. And try to use like, and here's how you might open this object right now with an open source software. And download and all of that. Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say that makes a lot of sense, I think, too, given how, in a relative sense, like VR and things that you can view with 3D objects in is kind of young in a hardware sense still. Like we like again, like Jim and I have done a lot of stuff with like emulation of really old software, but fundamentally you look at it on a screen and use a mouse and a keyboard. And we've been doing that with that type of software. It's easy to find a mouse and a keyboard still. People still use them. I still use them, right? So like that's pretty easy. But when you're talking about this kind of still emergent in a lot of ways hardware, and it's proprietary in a lot of cases, emulation doesn't even really make sense. I probably so. Do you see things that kind of with that preservation hurdle in mind? Does that are you there if that meaningfully changes the work? Like, do you see folks who say we can't do this period because of this limitation, and so now we're going to pivot in this direction? Or is that more of well, this is less preservable and we're going to continue with that?
I think I'll let Alex jump in a second, but I was going to say I've talked to Todd, who runs our Aries program, a few times, and I'm actually involved in a grant project with him right now. And I know that has come up where it's been like, hey, we built it on this software years ago, and now what do we do? That software was like bought out by this bigger company, and this happened. So it's kind of this complex issue overall. And even on the grant that we're involved in, like I mentioned, some of these grants are going from prototyping to implementing to actual building phase. And the one that we're involved in right now, we were afraid to write specific technology into the grant because we knew it was going to change so much over time. So I think in terms of like that planning process, just being more specific about what you're trying to do and not necessarily specific about like the exact technology or the exact tool, because that is going to change over time, especially in AR and VR world where we're seeing it kind of rapidly grow and expand, and feels like there's something new out every day. So being a little bit more open about, okay, this is the goal of what we're trying to do, and maybe this is a technology we'll consider, but also just being aware of that landscape as it evolves over time. And then in terms of the preservation piece, again, that breaking it up into those components and thinking about, here's the documentation around those components, here's the back end data of this, and all of those pieces to be able to reconstruct it. Maybe you're not using the same tools and technology that you did originally, but having kind of that rough information of what was the goal of the project, and how does what technology we have available to us now, how can we rebuild it with that new technology, even with the old stuff. I don't know if Alex, if you have anything to add.
Oh, always. I always do. And this is one of the benefits of having both our like more scoped out 3D program for the digital library and being able to collaborate with a group like Aries, because they're bringing in really cool projects and meeting like project needs for very complicated, I don't want to say clients necessarily, but partners. Mm-hmm. And they do very cool work. They're kind of using cutting edge technology, using new tools, seeing what's out there. And then we are being a bit more conservative. We're trying to work on creating lighter models that make it like very fast and quick and easy to access from our digital library and to share and to store. We're trying to work with Aries to say like, all right, so you're doing all of this crazy stuff and it's amazing. Let's write it down. Let's write down your workflow and write down what you're using, so that when we go back and we need to open it again in a couple of years, we can be like, all right, we use this, and this is a new alternative that is open source. And again, most of our objects that my department creates are, I say most, all of them are open access. All of them are non-proprietary. We might use, because we'll use like ZBrush, we'll use some proprietary things. But what we produce ultimately, like the object itself, is designed to be able to be downloaded. It's in a file format that can be used in almost any software that a 3D or VR, AR professional might use, and then to be manipulated. So
I'm going to ask a question, and I think it's a fun question, and I hope you think it is too. Why open? There's this discussion around open access, and I know it seems like a very basic question, but I arguably maybe it's not. Like, why open at Virginia Tech?
I think it's been a huge history of what Virginia Tech University Libraries has been is open access. I mean, in terms of the publishing world, we were one of the first universities that were publishing like open access e-journals back in the early 90s. So it's been a huge part of what our institution has stood for over the years, and that's kind of fed into a lot of it. I personally am a big fan of open just because of how the knowledge is disseminated that way. And I'm talking a little bit more about scholarship being a publishing person versus the technology. So I'll let Alex jump in terms of the technology. So just the knowledge dissemination, the ability to access things. I was actually doing a talk with a bunch of grad students a couple weeks back and made this point that somebody shared 5 open access articles with me, or sorry, 5 journal articles with me. 4 of them or 3 of them were open access. One I was able to access through Virginia Tech Libraries through our subscriptions, but one I wasn't able to access at all. So I skipped that one. So suddenly I was like, whatever, I don't need that article. So that's one of my biggest things is like, if you want your material to be read as an author or used as a researcher, and this goes to the technology aspect too, it's a lot easier to do so if it's already open. In terms of technology, I think it is one of those things where it allows people to easily recreate if it's open. Maybe they don't have all the same resources to recreate, but they're not hitting kind of those paywalls at the same time. I'm also a big advocate that open doesn't necessarily mean free, that there's still labor involved, that it's just a different business model. So open to me is not free. It is maybe free to the end user, but there's labor, there's technology, there's resources that go into creating open things. But Alex, I'll let you talk a little bit more about more of the open source technology piece.
Right. And the technology piece, it's in the same vein as what Corrine said. We value openness. We want to share. It makes it easier to grow, because when it's just like you're one little team and you're building a thing and you don't get any input, you don't give any input, you will produce something that is probably fine, but could be much better and would develop faster and would develop you'd be thinking about things that you wouldn't necessarily consider for your own institution that would be highly relevant to a smaller organization or to an organization that needs a lot more scalability. And access in general, I mean, we go into all these small nonprofits and free museums, and if you walk into this building, like, it doesn't cost you to see it. And again, as Corrine said, it's not free. There is a significant amount of labor, time, energy, expertise that goes into it from our end. But to an end user, like, if they can't physically go somewhere to see something, if they have a print disability, we need to be able to accommodate that. If they need to be able to download it to enlarge it, if they need to be able to download it and see the alt text, see a different color scheme, if they don't have access to a machine where they can download software, they need to be able to manipulate whatever object and have a way to like engage with the material with as little effort as possible, because that's the goal of the library. We share. I say our library. Some libraries maybe not, but ours, we like to share. I like to gush about all the cool things my library does. It's my favorite part of it. But I think it's a culture in the university for the most part, with the exception of proprietary research. We do a pretty good job of engaging and collaborating and sharing.
So a follow-up, and it's interesting to me, and it's something I'm trying to wrap my head around. So you may be like, well, that's good for you. Good luck. But so as you said with AWS, you have this huge black box, right? And it's prevalent throughout higher ed, throughout, computing in general. And there was a time that many of us can remember where you had that infrastructure on campus, right? And you had those developers on campus. That kind of boat has sailed. And one of the things I'm trying to think about is, as costs change and as things get more expensive, as more and more people invest in that, and then they can't get their work out, and then they charge more and more. So then there's just a business decision. We got to bring that stuff we're hosting there back, or that stuff we've offloaded to this developer back. Do you think, and again, open-ended question, that the pendulum will swing back, that we may see infrastructure and development and software moving back to instances like the university where a lot of this stuff started, and the internet kind of flourished in these spaces, these green spaces, if you will. So do you see any of that, or is it, in terms of how you're thinking of open, like we have to make that deal with the devil in terms of a lot of the infrastructure and a lot of development is going to happen outside of our institutions. We're just going to have to do as the best we can to share it. Long question. I know. I don't know if it has a point, but there it is.
That's such a great question, because I'm going to get a little meta into the digital preservation realm. Something I think about all the time is we still work for a university. A university is a business. They expect us to produce, and they expect us to continuously increase what we're producing every year, depending on the metric that is appropriate to what you're doing. Storage and everything we do runs on energy. So we leave a pretty large carbon footprint, depending on what we're using, how we're using it, and why. How do we balance that? How do we balance the KPIs that we are provided that we must meet versus scalability and sustainability? So that was my non-answer to your question, because I don't know. I think it's a great question, though. I think we move back and forth in this university from being centralized to decentralized. We'll kind of shift every 10 to 20 years from my knowledge in university governance. We'll go, no, everything's decentralized. Everyone should be trusted. Just let departments do what they want. And then we just moved back into, nope, that was a bad plan. We're going to centralize again.
Yeah.
And frustrate a lot of people in the process, but for reasons. So it's a great question, though. I don't know.
And it's hard too, from a perspective of like energy, as you were talking about, like literal efficiency. There can be some gains, right, in putting those eggs in one basket, if it's a large enough basket, right? So that's, it's a tough thing to evaluate and just be like, oh, there is no obvious answer, of course, but it is kind of. And it also totally matters scale, right? As you mentioned, like centralized versus decentralized. One of the things like that you always run into when you centralize is, sure, it can be more efficient. Sure, it can be cheaper sometimes, usually. But then what gets left off the table? What aren't we able to do anymore or support anymore? And so I always kind of like to think about like, are pockets allowed, right? Are things centralized and it makes it really easy for most use cases, but do we allow for these other weird things to happen? And how can we make sure that those don't go away and disappear?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Corrine.
Oh, go ahead.
No, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think, the centralization, yeah, from an efficiency standpoint, it does help. But then there are like if you centralize too much, you take the risk of losing like experimental projects, right? And that's where some of the most interesting things can happen, especially within academia, where people are like, I'm going to take this tool, whether open source or proprietary, and just see what's possible here and see what we can do that might, change experiences for researchers or students or whoever. So thinking about that piece as well, I think Alex said it's all about finding the balance between efficiencies, but also allowing that space for experimentation.
Sorry, this just reminded me what you just said. I'm sorry, it's kind of funny.
We
went through a process a few years ago where it's like, okay, the Division of IT has decided we cannot use any software that doesn't have a license agreement that has been approved by university legal and that we can maintain. Well, what doesn't have an agreement is Python. So technically, for a while in there, we like officially on record, we're not allowed to use Python. We use Python for everything. So that was crazy. So like, yeah, finding that balance of like, and now we've pushed that like black and white a little too far because that would disrupt so very much on campus.
Well, and where do those things apply and not apply, right? Does this apply to that ruling was obviously thought in mind of, vendors, business contracts, products, things you acquire in that way, I'm sure most of the people who made that decision weren't thinking of licenses attached to open source software or programming languages, right? Which those exist, of course, but well, in maybe not Python, but but that is probably not what they were thinking of. And so then you get in this space, and there's also, of course, the more things you restrict from people to use, that in my experience working in IT before at Reclaim in higher ed, usually what that does for faculty is it just makes them go do it themselves. And then we're kind of back at square one. So it's always a tricky balance of, obviously we need rules, like we need to make things sustainable, but how do we still make these rules like productive and not invent shadow IT basically, and invent these unsustainable projects that are really a shame when they disappear because they weren't able to be preserved, because they weren't able to go through the correct channels. It's not an easy thing to solve, or maybe is possibly not possible to completely solve even.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just thinking about that. We try to tackle that with versioning and file formats. That's one of our main ways of going about doing that, because with like digital humanities, you want to try out the new shiny cool tool. You want to see what it can do, how scalable it is, how long it's going to last, if people can use it, if you can use it or build on it. But many times I've seen projects like, well, we used it, it was cool, we're not going to use it again, it's probably going to die now. So what we can try to do is migrate file formats. Have this version here. We captured it with Web Archive. We tried to do some interactive capturing of the look and feel and the purpose, and then we'll migrate it a little bit. And I say migrate, doing a full-scale migration is not something we've had to do yet. I'm actually very scared of doing a full format migration in the future. But migrating, in the short term to something that is a little less proprietary. I mean, TIFF is still proprietary, but it's the best option. I don't love MOV. It's owned by Apple. Who knows what they'll do? WordPerfect, does anyone remember? But MOV is still... but it's still recommended by the Library of Congress. So there's that weird little balance in there of, there are things that we can do, none of them will be 100% effective. And that's okay. I think that's something we accept.
I think we're going to name this episode "Word Perfect, Never Forget."
Oh, please let me forget.
I'm so sorry. I'm sorry, Corinne.
The whole reason I got into this, which has been a great riff here, is like, I think the pendulum always kind of does come back. And when I brought up this idea of why aren't we thinking about moving stuff back to the university, developers and infrastructure, and I was poo-pooed by Bluehost, by Pantheon, by all the folks who have all the investment in you not doing that. But there have been interesting experiments recently by the folks who developed Basecamp, who said, you know what, we're going to get out of AWS and we're going to go into co-located, buy our own servers. And they're saving significant amounts of money for different reasons. And their business model may not be ours or university. So I'm not trying to say it's one-to-one. But I do think, like, it's always that point where you feel like we're beyond return, we're all in, that I think, it's a time, like you all had said, that these pockets in a university to start experimenting with an alternative that get me excited, right? And like, is the reason why I like working there so much is you kind of have a different idea, even though it's a business, to your point, Alex, but you often have a certain amount of protection to do some of that, with the idea that, there will be a new logic that emerges that has not been the dominant logic that everyone in the business world just kind of follows and says, yes, this is how it must be. Yes, this is how it must be. So anyway, not to draw too fine a line on that.
So I loved what you just said. I actually have a lot of trouble with everything being in the cloud. I like a little on-premise. I like the three-legged stool where you have a local, you have a on-premise, something solid state even would be better, and then one in the cloud. I like that idea, and it's all about resourcing.
Yeah.
We don't have, and most universities, even R1 institutions like we can't afford to pay developers enough to come in and do this level of work most of the time. I mean, and we have an excellent team here. I can't shout out the developer team here enough. They are fabulous, and we're growing that team right now. And if we had 20 of them, maybe we could reproduce something like AWS, but that is local, still scalable, cloud and on-premise. But we have 3, soon to have 5, and they're working overtime just to make sure that we have basic functionality in this thing that we're building, and still adding collections, and still solving problems, migrating VTechWorks DSpace to the newest version, helping me set up new buckets for testing, doing little random things over here. And it's just not scalable on that front. So really it's resourcing. And that's the pendulum coming back. I look forward to it. I don't think we're all in. In terms of getting things out, that's what we would call a test restoration. We run test restorations from anywhere we've got stuff. AP Trust is a good one, the Academic Preservation Trust, and AWS, both S3 and Glacier. Hopefully, Corrine, I think you've probably gone and, all right, can I download this thing that I put in here and make sure it's the same thing?
Mm-hmm.
And I know Special Collections does that. I know our data services does that. So doing these little mini ones so that we can prepare for the potential of a mass restoration and get out of AWS. Not to poo-poo AWS. Not to poo-poo, but
we like to poo-poo the AWS, so you're in a safe place.
I don't know if I'm allowed to do that, though.
I mean, we use it
It's
ourselves
hard.
too. For the thing with this, right, is that the whole point of something like AWS or Azure, like name a cloud, right, is that they aren't in one location. Like that, it's multiple places, and that I think is going to be a challenge for any school of any size, even really large ones, to replicate. And I almost think of instantly my brain goes to pie in the sky idealism of like, what if there was a co-op of schools that ran a cloud? It wasn't a public cloud, it was a semi-public cloud, and actually things like this do exist on a
Big
limited
12.
scale, right? What'd you say?
Stop.
The Big 12.
Right, yeah, but like you could imagine such a thing, but that comes with its own challenges too. And so, but I do wonder if we'll see things like that, because I think, Jim, the co-location model, like you said, like people do use that on a limited scale. What would that look like at a larger scale?
So Corrine knows where I'm going with this. I'm so excited you brought this up. They do exist. They do exist.
Sure.
They are based at Stanford right now. It's called, I said it earlier, Lots of Copies Keep Stuff Safe. LOCKS. It's the LOCKS program based out of Stanford, and that is what they do. They create both consortial LOCKS networks, CLNs, and private LOCKS networks. And those are communities, and they all agree to host a server on-premise or cloud, depending on what they need, or just be members and pay in a little bit. And then when you submit items in, it is replicated to however many number of nodes that your community has deemed the desired number, and they're just maintained. Some of their communities, they will sunset, but then new ones pop up all the time, and they are international. There's a global LOCKS network. It is very cool. I'll stop now.
That is awesome.
Get real excited.
I have some reading to do.
So is it LOCKS, LOCKS, LOCS? Like
LOCKKS, right?
Yes. LOCKKS. Lots of copies keep stuff safe.
Lots of copies keep stuff. That's very cool.
Yeah, and excellent team.
And it also points to the very fact that I think is interesting is we say, oh, it's impossible. And then well, actually, this group didn't think it was impossible and started doing it on a very small scale to create a very interesting example, for us to think about. I always think about the moment where, we got this brand new IT Convergence Center at University of Mary Washington, very cool building 10 years ago. It's 10 years this year. And part of what was imagined in that building was a whole server infrastructure, like a server space. And there's nothing in it. Like it sits empty. And I always go there and I'm like, you know, what could be? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. And I understand all the headache that goes with that, right? And the sysadmin at Reclaim is like, you're out of your mind. I want no part of a data center. So like, I understand the limits there. But anyway, thank you. You two are awesome for even entertaining that line of a kind of experimentation in this talk. And you all have been more than gracious with your time, with your unbelievable answers, and with just kind of joining us here on Reclaim TV. So I want to just say thank you both, Corrine and Alex, for joining us and for being such amazing guests and for sharing all that you do so openly. And the fact that you all are so vigilant about that idea of open and what that means is super exciting. For me, I mean, I think I'm with you 100%. I think that's what universities, if they don't have that, what do they have in that regard? So thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. I've so enjoyed this conversation. I love gushing about the work that we're doing at Virginia Tech and working with Corrine. That we had a question. I got to point it out. The funnest element of your archiving work was a question you'd posed to us. Very first thing was working together.
Yeah, we're anytime somebody asks about preservation or archives, I'm like, yes, that's a great excuse to work with Alex.
Band back together.
I had an idea that because as soon as I said, Corrine, do you want to come on this, session? And she's like, yeah, and Alex. There was no question that it was going to just be Corrine. And that's, we're such the richer because of that. So thank you both.
Thank you.
We appreciate this. This is very cool. I've enjoyed this.
Great. Well, bye-bye, everybody.
Yeah. Bye. Thank you.